Hey guys, and welcome back to Studio One with me, Gregor. Today we want to cover the limiter in this video manual. I've shown you how I like to use the limiter in one of my last videos. I'm going to link that right here for your reference. And I showed you how you can simply use the limiter to get rid of any kind of clipping that you might have on your output channels. But before we get into that, let's first of all talk about what the limiter is. So the limiter is a plugin that you find in the effects section of Studio One's browser. So we open up Studio One's browser right here. We go to the effects tab. We scroll down, and in classic Studio One fashion, you can just drag and drop that onto any channel. And what will essentially happen is that any clipping that might occur is effectively prevented. So in this mix, for example, if we assume that it would be clipping on the main out, I can easily simulate that by raising the bus volume until it starts clipping. I could just insert the limiter now by dragging and dropping it onto my main output. Reset the clip light and everything is under control. And we don't have any audible quality loss here, but we get rid of the clipping, which can potentially come to haunt us if we're trying to export a mix down. And then suddenly when we play this back on the system with converters that have less headroom, we would run into distortion and what have you. So this is one of the most simple ways to prevent that. But before we get into any more of these use cases, let's talk through the parameters on this plugin one by one. And I find that whenever you go through parameters on any plugin in Studio One, then it's an awesome idea to hit F1 on your keyboard to open up the context help. This will open up the Studio One manual exactly on the right page of the respective thing that you're currently looking at. So right now we have the limiter in focus. If I hit F1, it opens up the limiter manual. And if you hit F1 when the mixer console is selected, you get the mixer console chapter instead. So if you haven't used this feature before, if you haven't been aware of the context help, I can't recommend you enough to use that, because it's hard to imagine a better implementation for a manual than this, in my opinion. And when we open up the context help or the limiter chapter of Studio One's manual, we could see that it's a brick wall limiting processor with optional K-system metering. Brick wall means that we can set it in a way with the true peak button right here that no signal will make it past 0 dBFS or wherever we are setting our ceiling. This means that no clipping whatsoever can occur as long as this plugin is the last plugin on our insert chain. Then next to the True Peak button, we also have the option to use the limiter with soft clip. So then clipping is not being prevented, but a pleasant distortion / saturation happens instead, depending on how hard you're driving into the limiter input. You can set that either with the gain here or by simply raising the level of whichever channels are going into the limiter. I've done that previously by raising the bus volume here on my arrangement. And this can be a more creative application, but we won't go into that too much today. Then underneath we have the level meter section, which you could switch between peak RMS. So if that's selected, you can see the average loudness in RMS. That's the white lines here for the left and the right channel. You can also very easily read that because you get this little text box here, depending on where your level is currently set. And we have also a peak meter, and that would be like the blue outlines here for the left and the right channel. Very easy to read. We also have a K-system metering option. This is something that I don't personally use, but I know that a lot of people appreciate that. It gives you some color coding, and it also gives you, if you have calibrated your speakers to K-system loudness, a more accurate representation of what these values like 0 dBFS mean in the real world. Like I said, I don't use it, but I know that my good friend and colleague Joe Gilder uses it. And if you want to learn more about the K-system metering, and if you're interested in implementing that into your workflow, then definitely check out his video. I think he has a really cool and simple approach to it. And yeah, the video is going to be linked here in the top corner. Check it out. Okay, now we're getting into the bread and butter section of the limiter plugin, and that is the input and envelope sections down here. First up is the gain knob here, and I really like to adjust this parameter to just maximize loudness on my demo mixes when I export that for a client or for SoundCloud and things like that, just to make it sound a bit more convincing and competitive with all these maximized loudness tracks that you find across the internet. So if that's what you're after, then just hit play on your mix and turn up the gain while also having true peak enabled until you can hear like an audible degradation. In my case, I can raise it more than 6 decibels actually, and I don't hear any quality loss. If I bypass that, you notice how much loudness we've actually added. Pretty much for free. So this is a really cool way to just maximize loudness on demo mixes. Of course, this is not something that replaces the mastering job by any means, but if you try to send like an in-between result to somebody and you want to get their honest take on where you're currently standing, it can help certainly to raise the volume a little bit, because louder sounds better. Don't quote me on that. Next to the gain, we also have ceiling and threshold. So ceiling is like the upper cutoff point of the limiter. This means no signal makes it past -1 when it goes through the limiter. And the threshold lets us set from which point forward the limiter starts working. Just like on a compressor, if the threshold is not being met, then the limiter does nothing. And as soon as the threshold is being met, the signal is gradually attenuated. And as soon as the signal reaches the ceiling, it no longer passes it. So it's in many ways like a super extreme compressor. Set the threshold to where you want the gain reduction to start as you're driving into the limiter, and put the ceiling to the point where you have your absolute maximum output. So if you want no level past -1, you set the ceiling to -1. And if it's enough for you to have no signal past 0, then you would set the ceiling to 0. You can set it in any range between -12 dB and 0 dB fs. And then you can also decide the mode of the limiter. So if you have mode A, that's the cleanest limiter mode. That's the closest to the original, but it is a little bit slow. So if you have extremely percussive signals, some of them might actually make it past that ceiling point. If that's the case, you can switch it to mode B, which is much faster, but it could potentially degrade the quality of your signal very slightly, depending of course on how hard you're driving into the limiter in the first place. Then you have the envelope parameters. You can set the attack and the release here much like you could on a compressor, just with a bit less flexibility, because that's usually not needed at the limiter stage. And generally I would advise you to put attack to slow first, because then you don't immediately squash down the signal as the limiter threshold is being met. This can really shave off all the transients of your kick and snare, for instance, and just make it sound dull. Everything is kind of the same volume if you're not careful. So often I just prefer having the attack on slow first, and if that's not enough, I could still reduce to normal or fast. And then you have the release time here. The release time basically says how quickly gain reduction recovers after the threshold is no longer met. Setting that shorter would of course be the most transparent, but it can also be introducing a bit of distortion. Whereas if you set that too long, the gain reduction might not have fully recovered by the time the next transient is already hitting, which could in turn introduce a bit of pumping in your mix. You have to set that really by ear and to taste. And with that, we're already through the parameters of the limiter. And before I let you go, I want to show you just one more example for a use case, just for inspiration. I really like to use the limiter on my listen bus instead of the master output. What do I mean by that? Well, you might know that if you click here on the wrench icon inside of the mixer console, you can enable the listen bus, which is like an additional output of your main out, your master bus, if you will, but it's just for monitoring purposes. So usually you would use that for your room correction software and anything that you don't want to print into the actual mixdown of your song. And if we move the limiter from our actual master output now to the newly added listen bus, our monitoring environment. We can do that by dragging and dropping and then holding down shift. This is just going to move the effect. Now we can use the limiter to just predict the outcome of the mastering job already at the mixing stage. So that's something I really enjoy, because if I'm preparing like a mix down of a pre-master for somebody else, then I kind of want to predict the final outcome of the product at this stage already and anticipate that and mix accordingly. Also to make the job of the mastering engineer a bit easier potentially. And here I would use pretty much the same settings as before. I would maximize the loudness, because that's also kind of what happens in the mastering job. And then I would just see if I have to make any mixing decisions based on that before I export for the mastering job. Hopefully these use cases, tips and tricks, and this video manual were useful for you. And with that, thank you so much for watching.